How I'd like to start, I guess, is by asking you, and really putting you guys in charge, and tell me what it is you want to know in regard to vocational rehabilitation. And Dr. Schweitzer will just make note of those questions, and we'll try and be sure and cover those before we're done. That way you get what you paid for. So if you don't ask questions, you get the full 45 minutes nonstop. I mean, if there's nothing you want to know, I'll force feed you. So are there anything that you wondered before you came in here, or why did you come in for this session? What did you want to learn?
I'm interested in how VR can work with farmers in order to help them continue farming or to become a farmer. Because it's a great funding resource if they're able to do that, work together as a team. And how does that happen?
Okay. So she's going to make note of those, and we'll answer them as it fits in. But I don't want to miss that. What else?
My husband has received a lot of vocational rehab help, and I mean it has really benefited him being able to do things that he couldn't do very well before.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
I want to let you know it's very positive.
Good.
We have a customer that I've been told I need to contact Voc Rehab about, and I don't know what Voc Rehab is, so that's why I'm here to find out how that's going to help this customer.
Okay. What is vocational rehabilitation?
Our program works with Voc Rehab. We make referrals from them, or we send referrals to them through our program, with the farmers program.
Good.
I'm creating things for you.
That's fine. We'll want to be sure to address those.
I guess I'd like to know how it's funded too.
Oh, okay, sure. Okay.
Being out on the front line with talking with the farmer, what can a client or a caseworker do for you? How much do you want us to do, and what do you want left done for you to do?
Yeah. How can you, as an AgrAbility staff member, advocate for the person you're serving? Yeah. Okay.
Or when do you know when to make a good referral, too, right?
Okay. What is a good referral, or when to make a good referral?
Yeah.
Um,
Got it. I thought I heard something else in there.
Eligibility.
Anything else? Okay, so you guys have basically outlined what I need to address for you today, and I appreciate that very much. So the purpose of vocational rehabilitation is to empower individuals with disabilities, particularly individuals with significant disabilities, to achieve high-quality employment outcomes to which they aspire and that are consistent with their unique strengths, resources, priorities, concerns, abilities, capabilities, interests, and informed choice. This comes from the Federal Register, and that's where you can find it. Written policies governing the provision of services for individuals with disabilities. And so that's the resource. So, when you think about AgrAbility, you think about transition resources, you think about independent living centers. I would guess that this is your goal as well, that's a pretty good synopsis or a pretty good purpose for you. So what I'd like to emphasize, I guess, is that vocational rehabilitation should fit pretty well with whatever each of you may be doing. One of the things that Amber asked me to do, or Ms. Wolf, as she organized the program, asked me to do, is to come with a case study in regard to arthritis. And so I was thinking specifically of arthritis, and I could only think, and I've been working in vocational rehabilitation for 16 years, and so I don't know how many, my caseload is typically between 120 and 130, and so over those years, I don't know how many folks that I've met and and taken applications on and found eligible and provided services for, but I could only think of one person whose disability was, specifically arthritis. And of course, I wasn't thinking in terms of degenerative disc disease and those things. And if I were to think in terms of that, and we can talk about services along that line, it would probably be maybe 20% or a quarter of my caseload would have, a diagnosis along that line. I'd like to, in regard to that, I guess I think of it in terms we're born with about a 35-year warranty. And when the warranty, and we live longer than that. So, the doctor who did the keynote, basically he talked about wear and tear and being worn out or getting worn out. And that's, a significant portion of the people I serve, from year to year would have degenerative disc disease, spinal stenosis, that sort of thing. And they would be in their late 40s and early 50s a lot of times. But in regard to the one that I thought of, and it would have been rheumatoid arthritis, and I won't be able to tell you the person's name. I can tell you where he lives. I can drive to that where he lives. I can tell you where he worked. I can tell you where his wife worked. I can tell you he had 2 grown sons. One still lived at home. But I can't tell you I don't remember his name. But what he worked as, he was quality control. And he worked for an electronics company, Philips Industries. They bought Magnavox some years ago, and in Northeast Indiana, Magnavox was a fairly significant employer. And so his job, quality control in the plant, meant that he had to traverse the plant basically from side to side and end to end. And due to the rheumatoid arthritis, he was not able to walk those distances anymore. He was not able to, he just simply wasn't able to do that. And so what vocational rehabilitation was able to do, and this is in regard to, part of the reason this is maybe a decent example for you, is the purpose was to retain his employment. And when you think about people who make their living in agriculture, farmers, that's what we want to really look at, is retaining employment. And not, well, that's really what we want to look at. And so with this gentleman, and he and his sons had done a lot of the work themselves in terms of their home. His home was accessible to him, and that sort of thing. So what we looked at was him being able to get to work, and then him being able to do his job there at the plant, at the physical facility. And so the first, after the eligibility was complete, and we'll talk about all these steps, and the plan for employment was developed. The next thing that vocational rehabilitation did was we did an assessment of both the functional limitations that he had to, actually we got that from his medical reports, but then how do we address those functional limitations? And employed or contracted with an assistive technology professional to, assess what would work best for him. And in his instance, it was a power scooter would allow him to get wherever he needed to be in the plant. And so with that being the recommendation, then, how does he get the power scooter back and forth? And so we had to take a look at his vehicle and being able to modify his vehicle to transport the scooter. With a lift that allowed him to store it inside. He could transfer himself and get into the vehicle independently. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the distance from the parking lot, even from a disability, a space set aside for people with disability, to get from that into the plant, and then the plant itself, I don't know. My farm, where I live, is 9 acres, and I guess the plant could set on that. So that's what he would have to walk each day. So those were the services, and that worked well for him. He was able to continue working. The facility had made some accommodation for him in the meantime until he got was able to, with Voc Rehab's assistance, modify his van and obtain the scooter. And so he'd get to work, he'd unload, he'd get on, he'd drive into the plant, and then as a quality control engineer go about his work. So that's just kind of a brief synopsis in one instance. And again, what we were doing is really, because we were retaining his employment, that was a high quality employment outcome. And that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to continue working. It addressed his strengths. His strength was in being able to do the quality control work for that company, his abilities and capabilities and that sort of thing. So, and maybe we'll be able to refer back to that as we get to some of the other parts here. The Rehabilitation Act of this, one of the questions I had before we got started is vocational rehabilitation a federal program? That was essentially the question, and it is. We operate under the Rehabilitation Act. Each state then has their own plan of services. The federal and state match is actually, I rounded up one and rounded down the other, and it's actually 78.7% federal and 21.3% state. And I didn't make that adjustment on the PowerPoint. 21.3% state. Vocational rehabilitation, there is a program in each of the 50 states. In regard to Indiana, to my knowledge, has never provided enough money in their state match to get all that they could get from the federal dollars. And I'm not sure if that may be the case in other states or not. So the vocational rehabilitation mission is to serve eligible people with disability in obtaining and retaining employment that's commensurate with their abilities, interests, and limitations. And that's just kind of how I summarize that first part. We look at abilities, interests, and limitations. And really, we try to meet the individual needs of each person. That's the person we're serving. We aren't. I had a gentleman once who with a disability. He had experienced a stroke actually, and what he wanted VR to be able to do was to provide training for one of his employees to do what he could no longer do. And no matter how I tried to work through policy and stuff, we couldn't provide the services to somebody and the employee wouldn't have been eligible for the program. So while it would have been a service to him to allow his business to continue to generate the income it needed, we couldn't invest our dollars in training someone who wasn't eligible for the program. So that's what that would reference there.
What about a family member who is essential to help with the person with the disability if they had some need?
You mean like personal care
Yeah, maybe something like that, or
to get
that's
out of
theirs,
the house
so
in the
that's their
morning?
need, isn't it? Yeah.
That may require specific training in terms of, say, transfer or something like that.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Probably what we would look for is comparable benefit. So does a rehabilitation hospital provide that training?
Well, and there might be some state funding programs to help with some of that. Like in Maine, we have personal care programs that VR would probably refer them to us so that they can hire and employ that member to get them out of the house, get them dressed or equipment.
Yeah, and in regard to the gentleman I referenced, I did provide him with information in regard to workforce development programs in Indiana that perhaps could provide what he was looking for his employee. The other, responsibility is in regard to vocational rehabilitation, or in regard to my role, is to manage my financial resources so that whatever we do is necessary and reasonable. And by necessary and reasonable, if you think of a person who perhaps uses a wheelchair and they needed to have their home modified, and of course the wheelchair and will work better on a hard surface. So that's necessary. Solid oak flooring isn't reasonable. And so we would, in that instance, they would, if they needed solid oak flooring as opposed to, I don't know what, they would pay the difference. I mean, they could still have that, but we wouldn't pay the total cost. So the numbers like 00 and 02, those are called status codes, and basically my supervisor can take a look at my caseload and he can have an idea based on the status alone, based on that 2-digit number, what should be going on or where that person is. So a referral, so you can see it goes from referral to application, eligibility, and then planning development. Then the plan's approved, that's status 12. Restoration is kind of a separate one that it doesn't necessarily flow like this. Restoration would be either physical or mental restoration. So if the service they needed was, say, a prosthetic to continue their job, that would be the status they would be in, would be 16 for restoration. Training is just about everything else. Ready for employment, I've never used that one. I just go from 18 to 22, but I guess I could use it. And then 26 is that's the one that we're always looking for. That's a successful closure.
What's his IP stand for?
IP stands for Individualized Plan for Employment. Yeah, like any program, there are lots of initials. A couple of additional statuses is extended evaluation, and this may be relevant to AgrAbility staff. If you've ever, the importance of extended evaluation is if I take an application on someone and they're eligible, and I think that they may not benefit from services, that they may not have an employment outcome, that decision cannot be arbitrary. It has to be evidence-based, or it can't be subjective, it has to be objective. And so extended evaluation would be where we would provide the services to see if they could benefit from services. Well, I've never used that status either, because you basically have to do all the same things. Now, there is an advantage to that status, and so I may think about it in the future, but basically I had a person once on my caseload with multiple sclerosis, and essentially they could still speak and they could still breathe independently, and that was essentially the function that they had. And so, with evaluation, can they use a computer, use a sip and puff technology and the other things? And so I went to my supervisor and asked him, so do we, can they benefit from services? Can we provide? And of course he didn't know. So, we went to the regional manager, or the region manager, which would be his supervisor, and she said, you basically got to do all the same stuff, just do it. And so she didn't suggest that I use status 6. She just said, do it. And so, if you ever encounter a situation in regard to vocational rehabilitation where the VR counselor says, I don't think they can benefit, it's not a subjective call. It's objective on their, it has to be objective, and they would have had to, try to provide the services that were necessary for the person to benefit. And when I use the term benefit, I'm meaning in terms of employment, in terms of employment outcome. So you can kind of just file that, you could say, well, you could do an extended evaluation, and see if it's going to work or not. Services interrupted. Sometimes services are interrupted because a person, say they're in post-secondary training, and whatever the disability may be causes them to set out a semester. That'd be services interrupted. Post-employment service, after the case file is closed successfully with them with a person working, if they were to need an additional service that would be directly related to retaining that job, that's possible to provide that service without reopening the case. And so that may be, in some instances, depending on that, sometimes I'm going to prefer to reopen the case if the services that are required are fairly extensive. I had a person on my caseload who, as a child, waiting for the school bus, was hit by a semi. And of course caused spinal cord injury and loss of their right arm. And so they used the wheelchair. And so the first time I opened the case, we were able to work with a company to provide a one-arm drive wheelchair. And the person, had good computer savvy and things like that. Went to work for the library in the community, and did just a lot of good things for them. Well, because he's using the one-arm chair, and as we heard the keynote speaker today talk about the wear and tear, there was a time when a few years later he just wasn't able to get in and out of his apartment, wasn't able, just the wear and tear. So then we look at and I should back up and mention the one-arm drive chair was a standing chair, which allowed all of the positive things of standing in terms of weight bearing, to prevent loss of muscle mass, loss of bone mass, to help benefit in terms of urinary tract infections, those kinds of things. So the answer then, while his manual chair was still functional for him, what he needed was a power chair. I mean, the chair itself was still functional. It wasn't functional for him because of the wear and tear. But so, a standing power chair that he was then he was able to use that. And because of that, he not only continues his work at the library, but he's able to continue work for the library at another building half a block away in regard to their genealogical collection. And so kind of was able to expand his duties. So that could have been a post-employment service, but because of the amount of evaluation and the amount of cost involved in some of those things, I chose to reopen the case. And of course, I had my eye on getting another 26 for, another program year. I'm not all that benevolent. Well, I am, but. So we had a question in regard to eligibility. To be eligible for vocational rehabilitation services, the individual must have a physical or mental impairment that constitutes or results in a substantial impediment to employment, and they must require VR services, and that they would benefit from these services in terms of employment.
Does that mean you have to have a diagnosis?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep. And then, so those are so there are three things in regard to eligibility: diagnosis, substantial vocational impediment, and then the third thing, benefit from services in regard to employment. Anytime I say benefit, I'm meaning employment. So really what I'm looking at is the first two things when I'm meeting with someone and when I'm gathering information. It's the diagnostic, and then what are the impediments to employment. And so I gather that information a couple of ways. One, medical records. Medical records are dated. We pay for current functional capacity evaluation, psychological evaluation, those sorts of things. And then in regard to substantial impediment for employment, sometimes it's reasonably apparent. A lot of times I tell them, what on the work you were doing, what can't you do? Or what can't you do in the way that you used to do it? And I gather that information a lot of times from them. So for example, I mentioned the degenerative disc disease, and a lot of times, I'll meet a person that worked in construction, worked for the railroad, any number of things with degenerative disc disease, and typically it's between the L3, L4, L5, S1. So have fairly constant pain either down the back of the leg, which would be between L5 and S1 lumbar vertebrae, 5 and the sacral vertebrae. So pain down the back of the leg or the side or the front, as well as right there and in the hip. And so they can no longer, walk on an even ground or be no prolonged standing, a whole 8-hour shift, no prolonged walking, no, lifting, carrying, so those kinds of things. And so, in an example of construction or working for the railroad or agriculture, no repeated bending, twisting, those would be the functional limitations. So to require services and to benefit from those services, I kind of default to the person, says they want to work and they have a goal in mind, and I take them at their word. And if I thought they didn't benefit, we go back to it's not a subjective decision on my part, it has to be objective. And we evaluate that. So types of services are the assessments that I mentioned, counseling and guidance. That's, if everything I do should come under that umbrella, counseling and guidance. Vocational and other training, physical and mental restoration. Example of physical restoration may be assistance in purchasing a prosthetic. Mental restoration may be counseling. Support toward training, mileage reimbursement, child care, living maintenance. And one of the questions that I was asked before we got started too is about variations from state to state. This is probably one area where there would be a lot of variation from one state policy to another is in regard to support services. Interpreter services, job development, placement services. Employment is our whole goal, and so that is a fairly common service on each plan. Occupational licenses. Currently I have two, actually they've graduated, 2 people who just graduated in regard to becoming registered nurse, and so they need to set for the exam and that sort of thing, and that cost, in Indiana it costs $250, $200 for one exam and $50 for a licensing of some sort. So we're able to reimburse them that, we build that into the plan. Home and vehicle modification, assistive technology, the small business development. This may be an important aspect for people who work with AgrAbility. If there's a significant, change in the operation to accommodate some of the functional limitations that may have occurred, that may require, some business development and assistance that way. My approach would be to look at it as retaining employment. If it's Smith Farms or whatever, I'd want to look, even though you're going to change the operation, I'd want to look at retaining it as opposed to creating a whole new business, but that may be an area. And I know in regard to Indiana, that is one area where we purchase services from AgrAbility in terms of consultation for small business development. Transition services refers to high school students transitioning from public school into adult services, and the others are the IP, or the individualized plan for employment, drives all services. If it's not on the plan, we can't pay for it. And in some ways, the plan, which is agreed upon by the consumer or the individual, and me, the VR counselor, approved by my supervisor, that is, I don't say this out loud, but I think of it in terms of a contract. That if it's on the plan, I'm committed to provide that service. And so I really work with the person to try and make sure we get everything that may be necessary onto the plan. The assessment, the comprehensive assessment, all of the information that we would gather beforehand in terms of the occupational goal, the services necessary, the tools, equipment necessary, the assistive technology necessary, whatever it may be, that would all come from various evaluation or assessment. And that would be the rationale for putting it on the plan. Once the plan's in place, then we provide services. These are examples of assessment. And again, depending on what the, what the functional limitation may be. The plan has to have these components. Specific employment outcome. My approach to that is be as broad as possible because I want to be inclusive, and I've not been asked to make it narrower than that. So in some instances, such as the person who's completed a nursing program, I'm not using general labor there. I am actually using nursing, and then probably I'll stick healthcare worker just in case. But and then again, that has to be agreed on. I mean, when I say I'm doing it, I mean I'm typing into the computer, but the information comes from the person, from the consumer. The description of the services, the timeline. Of course, the timeline's always as soon as possible, but they don't let us put ASAP in there. You have to put a date. So, and then a description of the vendors, who's going to provide the service, how are we going to evaluate, whether the service is successful or whether it's doing what we intend for it to do. And then the terms and agreements are the responsibilities.
Feedback or something from someone when you're doing that? When someone you don't know how well you're doing, do you request for feedback?
Oh yeah, I get progress report. For example, if a student, in regard to the nursing student, for example, at the end of each academic term, they provide me with their grades. They have to remain eligible for student aid, which means a grade point average 2.0 or above, and then making progress toward completion. They basically can have one semester below 2.0, and that's called academic probation, and they're still eligible for services, for aid from Voc Rehab. Well, there's a whole lot of caveats, but essentially academic suspension, then they need on their own resources to bring it back up. So that's an example of progress. In regard to the wheelchair I mentioned, after he had received the wheelchair, there was as he was receiving, there was fitting, to make sure that things were adjusted and fit properly. In regard to the vehicle modification I mentioned, there was an after check to make sure the equipment was installed as specified by the evaluation, the prescription. Make sure all the equipment was there, make sure it was all working, make sure the tie downs were where they should be so you could access them, those kinds of things. So yeah, all through there would be progress or benchmarks or things that we would want to keep track of. And then the 26 closure, that successful employment, that the person agrees to it, that it's consistent, that they're able to do it, that they're interested in doing it, and it's in the limitations. There's no perfect match, but if the consumer's satisfied, then that's kind of how I measure that myself. And that can include self-employment. It can include telecommuting. It can include business ownership, such as owning your farm. That the job be in an integrated environment, in other words, not a sheltered workshop. And after they're placed into employed status 90 days after, the exception would be in regard to supported employment, where and you may not, in the work that you guys do, you may not encounter that too often, but there may be a longer period of time before closure to make sure the term we use is stable on the job. And basically what that means is working as independently as possible. And that it'd be at or above federal minimum wage. So we had a question in regard to referrals. Anyone can make a referral. AgrAbility staff can make a referral, a physician can make a referral, a high school teacher can make a referral, a pastor can make a referral, a parent can make a referral. What I ask for at a minimum is the person's name and how to get a hold of them. To complete the referral screen, I need the name, the address, the social security. No, actually, I don't need that to complete it. I need it to complete the application. Date of birth, gender, telephone number, referral source. So, you know, in regard to the person you were referring to, if you were to call the local office and give them the name, the person's address, the person's phone number, date of birth if you know that, what you guess the disability may be or what you know it is, that would be enough to get things started. How to get a hold of them.
So could that person, I know that she's undergoing tests right now because the doctor says, I don't know what it is. Is that too soon? And she's having a very difficult time with medical bills because she's only on food stamps and help from her township trustee. That's all she has. And so we're trying to get her from point A to point B, but I don't know if it's too early to refer her. But she can no longer work.
You know, my answer is going to be vocational rehabilitation is a slow process, and so it's probably never too early.
Okay.
In certain situations, we may find, in fact, that it is too early. I don't know, but I wouldn't worry about that. If I were the referral source, I wouldn't worry about that.
Okay.
I would make the referral and let vocational rehabilitation kind of work through that. So we talked a little bit about the funding. You know, it's a state federal match. How can AgrAbility staff make a good referral? And what I tell folks is, you know, if you think they could benefit from our services, refer them. You know, I don't expect you to do the eligibility. I don't expect my high school teachers or the high school teachers I work with to determine that. I don't expect, you know. And I've always worked for supervisors who allowed me to be inclusive in determining eligibility. They didn't expect me to be exclusive. They didn't expect me to weed out those who apply. They have always expected me to be inclusive in making those decisions. So I'm making an assumption that that's what you would experience. So did we kind of address that? Okay. We talked a little bit about eligibility. So getting up to the top two things, how can VR work with farmers to get back to farming? And then the benefits of VR. So in reverse order, do you have any specific questions in regard to benefits of Voc Rehab? Basically, in regard to AgrAbility, we serve as a partner and funding source, or I hope we do that. And I guess part of your question, I would rely, you know, if you were making a referral to me, I may rely on, you know, what do you know in regard to the functional limitations? I may rely on you to help me to understand how whatever the diagnosis or the situation is, how does that affect this person in their work on the farm? You know, what is it they can't do? Because, you know, a lot of, and this isn't in regard to people in agriculture, but it's people in every business. They typically aren't asked those kinds of questions, and they have trouble, you know, giving good answers, or perhaps a little shy in terms of saying they can't do, or something. So, you know, I may rely on that kind of input from you. In regard to further on after the referral or after the application process, I may rely on input in regard to, you know, what are the accommodations necessary, or what is the technology necessary, what are the changes. So those sorts of things. Any other specific questions that you may have?
You mentioned that they would have to, you'd find it successful if they obtained a job that was paying minimum wage, federal minimum wage. How do you measure that for a farmer?
Oh yeah. Well, this is my answer, and you know, if you talk to 500,000 VR counselors, you may get a different answer. But I'm gonna take what they tell me.
Oh, what they tell you to do.
And you know, I'm not going to ask to produce tax forms. I mean, I know it's you know, depending on the type of agriculture, you know, you use credit to finance your operation, and then the payday is all, you know, at the end or whatever. With the exception of dairy, maybe, where, you know, where there's a monthly milk check, or maybe you know, a farrow finish operation or something where, you know, there's a regular turnover. But so, you know, I'm going to just kind of work with the person to figure it out. And I'm not going to, and the other thing then is I'm not going to divide by the 80 hours a week they work. I'm only going to divide by 40. So that's how I would approach it.
So if it's the farm is paying its own bills, then, you know, and it can sustain itself, then
I don't know. Well, we would figure that out, and I probably wouldn't.
okay. No, I just think
I'm not going to penalize folks for working, you know, and demand things. So yeah, I don't know. That's not a very good answer, but I'm pretty honest about what I just told you without, hopefully, yeah.
When you provide the job placement, does it have to be full-time employment?
Yeah, she asked, does the job placement have to be full-time? And no, it doesn't. And again, we're considering the abilities, and then their interests, and then their limitations. I have a lot of folks on my caseload who receive Social Security disability, and to earn wages above the SGA substantial gainful activity amount, you know, they don't want to do that. So I've had probably the smallest amount, and again, this wasn't in regard to Social Security or anything else. It was in regard to what the person was able to do. Was probably 4 hours a week, you know, 2 2-hour days, and that's what the person relied on others for transportation, in terms of stamina and attention and some of those things, and in terms of what they were capable of, and what the employer was able to provide for them to do to be productive. It ended up being, you know, 4 hours. So there isn't a specific stipulation in regard to that. So anyway, our time is pretty much up.
Anybody fall through the cracks or anything that, you know, something might happen, they fell through the cracks, and then you had to, like, oh, we got to make up for this person. Did you ever have anything like that? Did you ever occur?
Yeah. Couple of different things, and our session's kind of over because there'll be another one. But so I've had people disappear. When we talked about the plan in regard to responsibilities, the only responsibilities I put on a person is that they do their best and that they follow through. And by follow through, I mean don't disappear. You know, respond to letters, respond to phone calls. If you got questions, if you got problems, if you got concerns, you got to talk to me, because I can't, you know, I don't know what they are if you don't tell me. And so I've had that happen. The other side of that is I tell people, don't hesitate to ever call me, because, you know, I'm working with a lot of folks, and if you wonder what's going on, call me. You know, so there are folks I've forgotten about. And there are folks that I've made the sticky note and lost the sticky note. and wake up at 3 in the morning and, 3 in the morning, 3 months later, you know. And so, yeah, it happens. Was that kind of what you were asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's times and through our program, sometimes they just disappear.
And yeah, and well, you know, I've probably made every mistake that can be made, you know. I just tried not to make it the same mistake twice. And sometimes people aren't ready, you know, when they first apply, sometimes they aren't ready. And sometimes later they are. And I've had people apply 3 and 4 and 5 times, and we never, well, maybe on the 5th time we do, or the 4th time, or whatever it may be. Sometimes I say, so what's going to be different this time? But I don't prevent them from applying, and I don't prevent, you know, so I don't know. Is that kind of what you were wondering?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Sure, sure.
Thank you.